Anakin Skywalker was a young human male born 42 years before the Battle of Yavin. Within the first 9 years of his life, Anakin, alongside his mother Shmi Skywalker, would serve as slaves on Tatooine before his blatant sensitivity would be discovered by the maverick Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn during the Naboo crisis. Upon being freed after Qui-Gon's bet with Watto, Qui-Gon would guide Anakin to the Jedi Temple for training. However, following Qui-Gon's death at the conclusion of the Naboo crisis, Anakin would be apprenticed to the recently knighted Obi-Wan Kenobi. Anakin would quickly establish himself as the most gifted student of his generation, progressing at a much faster pace than most of his peers. However, his arrogance and desire for control earned him few friends within the Order. Anakin would also be prone to violence and was emotionally unstable due to the traumatic experiences of his childhood. These traits would carry over and only worsen as he got older, in no small part thanks to the corrosive influence of Chancellor Palpatine. Shortly before the Clone Wars, Anakin would become infatuated by Senator Padme Amidala of Naboo, and would end up slaughtering an entire Tusken Raider camp on Tatooine following the murder of his mother. Directly involved within the Battle of Geonosis, the very first battle that sparked the Clone Wars, Anakin would step up as a legendary field commander within the newly formed Grand Army of the Republic, and would later be promoted to a Jedi General. Skywalker and Kenobi would distinguish themselves as the finest military assets the Republic had, and effectively became the poster boys of the war effort. 3 years after the Clone Wars began, Anakin Skywalker and Kenobi would be dispatched to Coruscant upon being attacked by the Separatist fleet and Supreme Chancellor Palpatine being kidnapped by General Grievous. Upon the rescue, Anakin would face off against Count Dooku one last time, and would end up beating the Sith Lord. After a fierce bridge battle and the escape of Grievous, Anakin would perform a miracle landing, saving both the Chancellor and his own master.
Another happy landing.
In a matter of days, Anakin Skywalker's life would make a most drastic turning point. After visions causing him to fear for Padme's life, combined with reaching a breaking point within his frustrations on the Jedi Council, Anakin Skywalker fell to the dark side and was dubbed Darth Vader by his new master Darth Sidious. Recruited on the eve of the Great Jedi Purge in 19 BBY, and arguably became the greatest Jedi killer of all time, sacking the Jedi Temple and slaughtering the Separatist Council on Mustafar, Vader helped usher in the newly formed Galactic Empire. However, Vader would be confronted by his former Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, and after a lengthy lightsaber duel on the volcanic world of Mustafar, Vader was defeated. Left to die in the hellish landscape, Vader suffered severe injuries. This required him to undergo a cybernetic refit in order to keep him alive. Being encased in a suit and learning that his wife had died, Darth Vader saw no other purpose than to serve Palpatine, and went the next 23 years leading the Great Jedi Purge, as well as enforcing the Emperor's will. However, Vader also knew that Palpatine only saw Vader as an unfit apprentice, and that his master would one day attempt to replace him. Darth Vader responded by attempting to train his own apprentice to aid him in taking Palpatine down, finally setting his sights on his own son, Luke Skywalker. It was within Luke's hands that Darth Vader was finally beaten. However, Luke chose to spare Vader's life, rejecting the dark side of the Force and provoking Palpatine's wrath. Vader stepped in to protect his son, throwing the Emperor down a reactor shaft, but not before taking too much electrical damage to his suit, causing fatal damage to his life support systems. Vader, within his final moments, returned to becoming Anakin, and looked upon his son with his own eyes before succumbing to his death. This matchup shall serve and operate as the finale for Season 1 of my own Versus series, and will serve as a precursor for what quality improvements are to be expected for Season 2. The primary reasons for this was in no small part due to my good friend Deadponic, who has aided me in solving production issues and overcoming major obstacles that weighed down my previous videos. On top of this, I have taken massive efforts to improve where my teenage self started, and after learning to actually script my voiceovers and make quality improvements, I can rightfully say that most of Season 1 is horribly outdated. It is for that reason that I will eventually make a redux of most of my Season 1 matchups, to not only provide better quality in voiceover, but to also update the context thanks to the new sources made available since then. Now on for clarifying this matchup. Considering that I am talking about two versions of the same character, I found it appropriate to state which time points of them I am weighing against each other. For Anakin Skywalker, all of his appearances leading through the Mustafar duel will be accounted for within this analysis, with his actual prime being that of his final confrontation with Count Dooku on board the Invisible Hand. As for Darth Vader, his appearances from the time of first being placed within the suit through his final confrontation with Luke Skywalker will be included, with his prime being considered right before the events of Return of the Jedi. My analysis of Anakin Skywalker will be directly drawn from the prequel trilogy, including its adaptations portrayed in the films, comics, novels, and visual dictionaries, the 2003 Clone Wars microseries and its respective tie-ins, the 2002 Clone Wars video game, the Star Wars Republic comics, the Visionary comic anthology, and TCW. However, it needs to be made clear that Anakin's appearances within TCW for this analysis shall be considered secondary compared to his EU appearances, as this analysis will mostly be stemmed from Legends continuity, specifically classic expanded universe material. The only reason I am even including TCW is both out of partial obligation, considering I am including some canon sources for my Vader analysis, and because in spite of the show writing Anakin completely out of character compared to his film depictions, his combat capabilities remain mostly consistent, with the only sin weighed against him by the show being that he is underpowered compared to his EU appearances. But in fairness, every major character in TCW suffers that problem. I shall also state that the Revenge of the Sith video game will also be used as a secondary source and visual representation of his capabilities. Meanwhile, my analysis for Darth Vader will be drawn from a mix of canon and Legends material, including but not limited to Star Wars Episode 3 through 6 film, comic, and novel adaptations, Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, the Dark Times comics, the Force Unleashed 1 and 2 adaptations and its respective tie-ins, the Shadows of the Empire multimedia project, the Darth Vader comics produced by Marvel, Jedi Fallen Order, Jedi Survivor, Star Wars Rebels, Rogue One, and Star Wars Lords of the Sith, with background information for both characters including the Jedi Path, the Book of Sith, the New Essential Chronology, the Complete Reader's Dictionary, the Essential Guide to the Force, the Essential Guide to Weapons and Technology, and the Star Wars role-playing game, specifically the Dark Side Sourcebook. I have also decided that for my analysis of Darth Vader, I will be omitting the Kenobi show produced by Disney in 2022. As a disclaimer, my issue is not that Vader lost a fight to Obi-Wan, as not only was that a likely possibility to happen within any rematch taking place between Episode 3 and 4 from a thematic standpoint, but it is something that literally had to happen to salvage some semblance of continuity from the damage any confrontation would make. No, my issue lies with how it happened, as not only were the fights poorly choreographed and edited, to the point of it looking like a mediocre fan film, but they completely misrepresented both of the characterizations as well as the skill and power level both characters were in. I would even argue that the Kenobi show finally negated one of the few things I felt Disney canon had done right and not screwed up, which was maintaining consistency with the prequel trilogy characters and Darth Vader within combat capabilities. Damn it, Disney. Be that as it may, I present Anakin Skywalker versus Darth Vader, the Chosen One's mirror war. If these two versions confronted each other in live combat, who would win? Anakin Skywalker was a human male at 22 years old who was considered one of the most adapted Jedi warriors of his era. Within his physical prime, Anakin stood at 6 feet and 2 inches tall with a remarkable athletic build. His early childhood as a slave prepared Anakin for a physically demanding and active lifestyle. These capabilities were brought to their full potential after a decade of Jedi martial arts training. Anakin would also suffer wounds in battle, mainly within a scar on his face near his right eye during a skirmish with Ventress, and the loss of his right arm during his first fight against Count Dooku on Geonosis. Even when compared to non-humans, Anakin was considered one of, if not the most physically fit Jedi of his era, with his performance level being nothing short of a Spartan. These performances of physicality were showcased during the Mustafar duel, where Anakin nearly physically overpowered Kenobi within vicious hand-to-hand combat. Anakin's two most powerful attributes lay within his strength and speed, his strength being comparable to that of a meteor strike by Count Dooku, and the bounty hunter Dirge directly crediting Anakin as the fastest Jedi he had ever fought. These top two attributes were only reinforced by both Anakin's remarkable stamina and his unrelenting endurance, both of which were showcased in Anakin's survival of the Geonosis massacre, taking a hit from Dooku's lightning and continuing to battle him to nearly a draw, taking Asajj Ventress's telekinetic bombardments before overpowering her, enduring multiple hits from electricity and light whips while fighting, thrusting his prosthetic arm into the seismic generator on Nelvon, resulting in the destruction of the arm, and slugging out a war of attrition with Obi-Wan Kenobi on Mustafar, with him barely tiring. By the Battle of Coruscant, Anakin's new prosthetic arm was custom-made, designed and built by Anakin himself, and served as a sturdy replacement for his original organic arm, rather than trying to emulate the original human arm in design. Instead of covering it with artificial skin, Anakin would cover his arm with metal reinforcement designed specifically to help it resist damage as well as to match the proportions of his original arm. The prosthetic provided Anakin with superhuman grip strength that was capable of shredding metal, and over time, Anakin would come to prefer the prosthetic to his original arm. At the time of his death during the Battle of Endor, Darth Vader was a 45-year-old human male. However, he stood far from a typical physical specimen. After the injuries he sustained on Mustafar during his battle with Obi-Wan Kenobi, Vader was extremely burnt and was forced to be encased within a cybernetic suit to keep him alive. Relying on the suit's respirator to maintain his ability to breathe, had all 4 of his limbs replaced by prosthetics, cybernetic enhancements to regulate his essential organs, Vader had truly become more machine than man, with every alteration being encased in a suit of dark armor. After his cybernetic reconstruction, Vader's physical performance stood as a trade-off from his former self. On one hand, his prosthetic limbs in combination with chemical enhancements from his life support systems granted him superhuman strength, enough to pick up a full-grown human male with an outstretched arm. Because of his biological functions being regulated by machines within his body, Vader's endurance and stamina was nearly unlimited, while his heavy armor enabled him to be extremely durable, with it even being able to tank lightsaber hits. However, because of the bulkiness and weight of his armor, Vader's range of movement and mobility were impaired. While he did maintain great dexterity within his handwork, he was unable to pull the same kind of gymnastics he formerly could as Anakin. While Vader's strength was enough to simply throw off balance opposing targets, Vader's stiff movement meant that opponents of highly capable speed could outmaneuver Vader and even score hits on the Sith Lord. Vader compensated for this through stalwart defensive postures, allowing the opponent to make the first move, then using his strength to stagger them. This conservative approach was also done with the goal of protecting his vulnerable chest control panel. In conjunction with most Sith, Darth Vader also faced some dark side degradation, with the typical pale skin and yellow eyes being the most specific examples. Vader attempted to compensate for these by regulating his use of the dark side and even worked to use dark side healing in an effort to repair his body. However, such attempts were met with mixed results. Overall, Darth Vader was a physical powerhouse, a juggernaut of physical strength, stamina, endurance, and durability. He has survived injuries that would leave others a wrecked mess, such as the vacuum of space, a grenade explosion, multiple amputations, and even being buried alive. Quite literally a walking King Tiger tank, if I summed it best. However, Vader also suffered the weaknesses of a typical heavy tank, having his mobility and range of movement impaired, with Vader having to constantly draw on the Force to compensate for this, and was vulnerable to highly skilled opponents who were aware of the mechanical weaknesses and gaps of his cybernetics. However, Vader's weaknesses should not understate that he was one of the most finest physical combatants within the Star Wars galaxy. This conclusion is quite complicated. Both Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader were physical powerhouses. However, when scaling them against each other, their differences stood as trade-offs. In terms of physical strength, both Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader had extremely impressive levels, with both having massive degrees of Force augmentation. However, Vader has a slight advantage due to his cybernetic enhancements. In terms of endurance and stamina, Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader both could reliably endure for a long period of time, with both displaying a consistent ability to slug it out in a war of attrition. However, Vader does have greater resiliency due to a suit of armor protecting him from damage, while Anakin still remains an almost pure organic being. However, their most drastic difference stood within speed and agility. Anakin Skywalker was regarded as a very fast and agile Jedi Knight, with displays of being highly capable within dexterity and direct accolades stating he was one of the fastest Jedi within the Order. Meanwhile, Darth Vader suffers severely within his own speed and agility as a consequence of the stiffness of his prosthetics and the weight of his armor. This then leaves the question of which set of physical advantages would be more significant in this matchup. In my opinion, that would be Anakin. Yes, Vader is stronger than Anakin, but Anakin is strong enough to match Vader's blows and is able to compensate for some of the difference with Force enhancements. Yes, Vader's suit does grant him greater durability and provides him with a marginal room for error that Anakin simply lacks. But Anakin has a large track record of taking punishment consistently without it getting to him too much, and does not have any vulnerabilities within the control panel. Speed is the one field that has a big enough difference where Vader cannot close the distance on Anakin's advantage. While I do believe Vader would be able to properly defend himself against Anakin's speed, it still places him at a disadvantage and a factor he would constantly have to account for. Anakin Skywalker gains the edge in physical capabilities. Anakin Skywalker was one of the most talented prodigies with a lightsaber. Taking full advantage of his natural gifts, Anakin would quickly surpass all of his peers, and would develop his skills to a level comparable to the greatest masters of the Order in less than half the time. It was this growth combined with Anakin's relentless conduct that earned him the poster boy title of the hero with no fear. Anakin began his career specializing in Xian, which was the variant of Form 5 designed to deflect and redirect blaster fire. However, throughout the Clone Wars, Anakin would switch over to Djem So, the dueling-centric variant of Form 5. Djem So was designed as a strength-oriented style specifically tailored towards parry and counter, as well as overwhelming an opponent's defenses through physical domination. In essence, peace through superior firepower. Anakin's application of Djem So became so effective and refined that Count Dooku himself regarded Anakin as the finest Form 5 specialist he had ever encountered. Anakin supplemented his study of Djem So with an advanced knowledge in Form 4 Taru, which relied on heavily Force-assisted acrobatics. had a competent knowledge of Jarkai dual-blade fencing, and dabbled within Form 1 Chi-Cho and Form 6 Nine-Man, though the latter two were merely served to help Anakin cover his bases and did not factor into the use of his actual style. Although Anakin Skywalker's conduct was fundamentally opposed to that of Obi-Wan Kenobi, it is clear that his master had a direct influence on Anakin's own combat style, with their most drastic differences stemming from Anakin's conscious attempt to distance himself from Kenobi's technique. However, Anakin did suffer notable shortcomings and trade-offs. Like most Tajemso specialists, Anakin benefited from a tight defense met with effective counters, and could deliver rapid-fire power blows, but also suffered from grounded footwork hampering his mobility, which resulted in him being vulnerable to physical assaults. Anakin compensated for this by personalizing his technique of Tajemso and effectively created a hybrid style between it and Ataru. On one hand, this allowed Anakin to overcome Tajemso's most common weakness and enhanced his offensive output. On the other hand, it did compromise much of his defensive viability and caused him to be more open to enemy attacks. In spite of the shortcomings of this technique presented, this was Anakin's go-to approach, both when on the battlefield and in single combat. Anakin was also refined in channeling force-based attacks into his lightsaber sequences, particularly favoring the use of lightsaber throw. On top of his impressive technique, Anakin would end up as one of the most experienced lightsaber duelists of his era in spite of his young age. He had a large combat record of facing off against Count Dooku on more than one occasion, and eventually besting the Sith Lord, had multiple engagements with the Dark Jedi assassin Asajj Ventress, and faced off against the seasoned Jedi killer Dirge. On top of this, Anakin throughout the Clone Wars had repeated sparring matches with his master Obi-Wan Kenobi to further refine and improve his skills. In terms of combat strategy and tactics, Anakin Skywalker almost always took the path of high risk, high reward. As described in Jedi Trial and showcased in TCW, Anakin's priorities always focused on what I would describe as planned improvisation, which had him align his troops to operate smoothly and in some ways predictably to free himself up to do what he felt was needed. This would be reinforced by Anakin's emphasis on intelligence gatherings, with he himself often scouting missions on his own. However, in spite of Anakin's profession within logistics, he was not a grand strategist, and more often than not opted to take the direct approach, leading full frontal assaults on key strategic targets, regardless of the odds or tactical options, in a manner equivalent to the Death Star trench run.
So I assume the plan is to crawl through the sewer, work our way to the shield generator, fight our way through the defenses, blow up the generator, knocking out the shield, and all our troops swarm in and overwhelm the enemy.
Yep, let's go.
What this meant was that Anakin would place himself in the most high-risk situations in order to achieve the most immediate path to victory. The only reasons that Anakin's tactics were even in the realm of possibility was that Anakin was one of the few people powerful and skilled enough to pull them off. On top of the fact that most enemy strategists would not predict the move, considering that such tactics would be otherwise dismissed as outright being regarded as reckless at best or insanity at worst. However, these advantages did not transfer over into single combat, as Anakin's overcommitment to direct assaults went from unexpected on the battlefield to remarkably predictable in dueling. While Anakin did not lack versatility as a combatant, he only ever switched his technique when rooted in aggression and not tactical consideration. This meant that almost any time he went against an especially challenging opponent, his answer was to dig deep and fight harder, not smarter. The only times he has consistently showcased clever tactics in single combat was with Obi-Wan beside him, such as when they both faced against Count Dooku on the Invisible Hand, opening with their secondary styles to place the Count in a false sense of security, before suddenly switching to their primary styles and pressuring Dooku with a hammer-anvil strategy. However, considering Kenobi was present in all of these instances, it is safe to say that the uses of these clever tactics were more associated with Kenobi than Anakin. On top of Anakin's reckless abandon, He was also extremely vulnerable to psychological warfare tactics due to his own emotional instability. He was left easily manipulated and lost his cool with little effort. While Anakin at his most rageful was the point in time he was at his most dangerous, it was also when he was at his most moronic, and almost all of his defeats came down to overextending and leaving himself completely exposed. In conclusion, Anakin Skywalker was a nearly unstoppable juggernaut who accomplished the impossible and made it look easy, the reigning Tajemso specialist in the Jedi Order, and a remarkable swordsman who matched and overcame some of the greatest masters of his era. However, he was also effectively an unhinged lunatic who consistently caved into psychological manipulations and only knew to double down when things got hard instead of taking another approach. He can get back up when knocked down and deal heavy punches, but he does not know or likely does not care when another approach is needed to win. He is an overall street brawler, not a classical swordsman. After suffering his defeat on Mustafar at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Darth Vader was forced to undergo a complete cybernetic reconstruction which had robbed him of the fast-paced gymnastics dueling he was previously capable of. Because his cybernetic add-ons and the weight that came with it hindering his mobility, Vader was forced to completely rebuild his combat technique and reconfigure his fighting style to compensate for this. Like his previous self as Anakin, Vader maintained a specialization within Form 5 Tajemso in order to fully leverage his enhanced physical strength, and also borrowed elements from all 7 forms of lightsaber combat into his personal technique. Specifically, Vader backed up Tajemso with Form 2 Makashi and Form 3 Surisu to balance out the loss of Ataru as his main backup style. Vader's revised technique was designed around making efficient movements to make the best use of his remaining dexterity, while also leveraging his full strength. He used the weight of his armor to assume both stonewall defenses and bulldozing offensives, designed to keep his opponents pushed back. Vader would also make use of short, calculated bursts of speed to make quick steps out of danger, while also making use of flying leaps to cover longer distances. Darth Vader's main use of blade work was composed of conservative yet powerful slashes, stabs, and blocks, typically keeping his hilt close to him with a two-handed grip. Offensively, Vader would either relentlessly pound targets with strong lightsaber strikes in order to exhaust them within their attempt to block him until they fell into submission, or would do a fencing probe-based style, designed to subvert the opponent's defenses through a combination of precision and conservative strength, likely borrowing this doctrine from Makashi. Defensively, Vader kept a tight guard specifically designed to protect his vulnerable chest controls and other key components. To add on top of this, Vader heavily prioritized control over both his and his opponent's weapon, whether through pounding them with heavy strikes to force their blade to block, thus exhausting their energies, forcing them into saber locks that he would dominate, or breaking down their defenses through binding their blades. While Vader was first and foremost a duelist, he was also capable in unarmed combat, backing his swordsmanship with punches, kicks, grapples, and headbutts, utilizing his entire body as a weapon, likely stemming from Ataru. Complementary to his use of Form 5, Vader has consistently displayed backing his lightsaber technique with fluid integration of telekinesis to blindside enemy combatants and demoralize them. These psychological projections were only further reinforced with Vader's mastery of Doom Mach, relying on verbal taunts and projections of power in order to demoralize the opponent and throw them off their game. While Darth Vader was willing to go head-to-head against opponents, especially those he explicitly considered inferior to him, he more often than not preferred to keep his opponent at arm's length, grinding them down through the war of attrition rather than overwhelm them outright. All of these factors contributed to Vader's greatest strength, which was his pattern recognition. To further clarify, I turn you to Deb Ponick.
Practically every source that has ever depicted Darth Vader in a live combat situation, be it battlefield or duel, has stated how similar to a droid he is. Vader's overall thought process and outlook is based on a very binary and computational observation of the opponent's personality and behavioral patterns, building both his fighting method and strategies in live combat around these observations, and tailoring his own technique and mindset to respond in kind. Vader's approach to combat as a whole was based on his own obsession with order and control, forcing enemies to conform to his black and white worldview. Combining this with his masterful use of the psychological warfare techniques of Dun Mok to ensure that victory was not only certain but guaranteed. Applying these traits specifically to lightsaber combat, one can see how Vader functions as a whole, an analysis that is supported by the description of his technique in Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader. Similar to Dooku and Grievous, Vader applied his knowledge of the seven forms and how they could be used against the Jedi. Combining this with his observational skills and his knowledge of the Jedi mentality to recognize the core aspect that was the foundation of their technique, and then tailoring his own style to exploit the specific weakness of a given opponent. Additionally, as Vader continued to train and develop his technique, his analytical and martial skills also evolved. The ASV-19 droids that Vader trained with were programmed with the knowledge and skills of hundreds of unique sword fighters, indicating that Vader attempted to broaden his knowledge base and understanding with a high degree of success. It can also be inferred via observation of the source material that Vader eventually advanced to the point where he no longer required a basis for comparison of an opponent's fighting method, developing the ability to recognize and exploit the individual patterns and behavioral habits of a given fighter. Because Vader was so perceptive and his observational skills were so refined, a consistent fighting style became a predictable one to him. The repetition that is the basis of consistency being something he can assess, predict, and ultimately dissect like a surgeon. Against Darth Vader, any measure of consistency, no matter how small, equates death. For all intent and purposes, Darth Vader was Yuri, and all the Jedi were Yusho Duel Academy students. The Jedi and Yusho were similar in that their heavily standardized training made dueling one much like dueling any other, and their combat experience was limited to mostly fighting others like themselves. And just like Yuri, Darth Vader was like nothing that they had ever encountered, but where they had no idea how to combat him, he knew exactly how to deal with them. And then one factors in Vader's skill advantage, physical superiority, and analytical mindset, and you get a winning combination. Vader only experienced difficulty when forced to contend with fighters that actively avoided this habit, their only consistent pattern being the unexpected. Prime examples of such improvisational freeform fighters were Rowan Shrine and Galen Merrick, and what they essentially did was adapt their fighting method based on changing battlefield conditions in order to confuse and keep their opponents guessing about their intent. As a result of this, their fighting method had no consistent core element for Vader to recognize, and no behavioral pattern for him to exploit. Like Yusho, the vast majority of fighters, Jedi or Sith, tend to fall into the trap of specializing in narrow, albeit versatile skill sets at the expense of true tactical versatility, falling into the pitfall of simply employing the same tactic again and again in every combat situation. And against such opponents, Darth Vader simply adapts and overcomes. But against that 1 in a million fighter who breaks the mold and is consistently inconsistent, the dynamic quickly changes from Yuri versus the 5 Yusho students to Zane Truesdale versus Jaden Yuki.
As martial combatants, both Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader shared a great deal of similarities, but also stood with drastic differences. Both stood as power duelists who dedicated themselves to Djemso's mantra of peace through superior firepower. Both dedicated themselves to compensate for their perceived mechanical weaknesses through marrying their style with other forms, and both achieved most of their development through battle experience over academic study. However, where they most differed is the ways they applied themselves, and how their tactics and experiences shaped their outlook. Anakin Skywalker took his already adequate knowledge of Ataru and hybridized it with his development of Xi'an and later to Gemso, turning himself into a blitz power duelist. Meanwhile, Darth Vader built his variation of Gemso true to its mechanics, but integrated elements of all 7 forms into his own technique. One tried to reinvent the form while the other worked to supplement it. However, neither hold any type of technical advantage over the other, as both their variations are perfectly suited to counter the other. Anakin's blitzkrieg use of Form 5 would serve as an overwhelming approach against Vader, while Vader's stonewall defenses met with his integration of the other forms, especially of Makashi and Surisu, allows him to effectively operate as a combination of Count Dooku and Obi-Wan Kenobi, both of which operated as powerful foils against Anakin's technique. It makes it an overall impasse. However, in spite of their mechanics and forms being evenly matched, what determines the edge in martial combat lies in their conduct. While Skywalker's skills with the blade could not be understated, as he was the reigning master of Form 5 for his era, his effectiveness was predicated on his ability to simply outperform his adversary, and anytime he goes against an especially challenging opponent, his approach is almost always to dig deep and fight harder, not smarter. As a result, while Anakin Skywalker was not a tactless brute, he shared similar weaknesses with leaving himself exposed. While Vader does suffer a similar weakness of predicating his advantages on strength, he is more pragmatic and balanced with his skill sets, opening to recognize and get a feel for his opponent before building counters accordingly. What is important to highlight is that Anakin Skywalker spent his entire Jedi career under the assumption that his ability to simply outperform his opponents would lead to victory, while Vader began his career with a defeat, teaching him the hard way not to rush into engagements and instead build his tactics to not automatically assume victory, but instead to protect himself from quick defeats. These advantages are only made worse when factoring psychological warfare tactics. Darth Vader's use of Doom Mach enables him to have an easy time undermining Anakin's resolve and provoking an emotional reaction, a fact only made worse given Anakin's already existing vulnerability to psychological manipulation. While some would argue Vader's psychological attacks would provoke Anakin into an offensive frenzy and overwhelm Vader in a similar manner that Anakin did to Dooku, or what Luke did to Vader, this is not the most likely outcome, as not only would Vader of all people be capable of undermining Anakin's resolve and cause him to lose his focus, but even if Anakin ended up cutting loose, Vader would be prepared to defend and counter against it. Even if we were to discount Vader's already pre-existing knowledge of his past self, which I don't, it does not change that Anakin's lack of versatility and commitment to offense would be something Vader would be able to quickly recognize and counter. He may have enough skill to match Vader, but he can only match him, not outperform him. However, while Vader is by far the more skilled, tactical, and experienced fighter, Anakin's threat level cannot be denied, and Vader would not be able to overpower him, but instead would have to outsmart him. Be as it may though, Darth Vader gets the edge as a martial artist and lightsaber duelist.
To say it lightly, Anakin Skywalker stood as an anomaly in the Force, a virgin conceived off of midichlorians and held the highest midichlorian count in the history of the Jedi Order, with over 20,000 per cell. When taken into the Jedi Order, Anakin was the most talented student of his generation. Anakin trained as a Jedi Guardian, the combat specialists of the Jedi Order, which oriented their skill sets more to lightsaber combat and were typically committed as warriors against injustice. This aligned strongly with Anakin's militant mindset and beliefs. His training as a Jedi took place during a period of civil unrest and later a catastrophic galactic war. His mentality reflected this, being highly rebellious against the authority of the Jedi Council and wanting greater freedom to act, while also conducting himself within battle as a martial enforcer. Furthermore, Because so much of Anakin's development took place during the Clone Wars, he never truly gained any sort of reverence with the Force, instead seeing it as a blunt instrument to use and abuse. This mindset was only further encouraged by Chancellor Palpatine, who influenced a great deal of Anakin's outlook. Because Anakin mainly specialized within lightsaber dueling, the majority of his Force-based powers were geared towards physical enhancements. He had demonstrated use of these powers since even his childhood prior to joining the Jedi Order, mainly through enhanced senses when piloting. His Jedi training would enable him to further expand on these enhancements into strength and agility. Both of these attributes became core components within his combat style. These enhancements were only further made more drastic thanks to his natural aptitude towards dark rage, his build-up and frustration leading him to lose emotional control, which ironically made him more powerful and dangerous. Anakin was also naturally gifted within precognition and foresight, causing him to have dreams and visions at a semi-regular basis, as well as further enhancing his reflexes. Skywalker was also a skilled telepath, who was able to employ mind tricks on even large groups, such as when he calmed the patrons in the Outlander Club on Coruscant after Kenobi disarmed Zam Wesell. On top of this, Anakin could use Beast Trick to calm and influence animals, such as when he temporarily tamed and mounted the Reek in the Geonosis arena. However, Anakin typically preferred machines over living mounds, not feeling comfortable writing anything with a mind of its own, a sentiment called out by Obi-Wan Kenobi. While not confirmed, I agree with Gen Sarai 1's assessment that Anakin likely had a gift within Mechaduru, given his natural talent within building and repairing droids, as well as personally building and customizing his own arm. In terms of combative abilities, defensively, Anakin had a strong active defense and could parry opposing Force-based attacks with his own. However, his passive defense left a bit to be desired, with frequent cases of Force attacks staggering him when caught off guard. He could cut or power through thrown objects, but he was often caught off guard and battered. Anakin also did not develop any application of energy-based powers, which meant he could only defend against Force lightning with his lightsaber. That was unless he was charging in recklessly, in which case he was caught off guard and electrocuted. However, Anakin was of the opinion that the best defense was a strong offense, and that is where he channeled most of his powers. While his only offensive power was telekinesis, he was not lacking in either range or magnitude. Anakin would often use Force pushes to stagger opponents, either pushing them through walls or off ledges. On the battlefield, he would often make use of Force waves to scatter large groups of enemies. In almost all combative situations, he would resort to telekinetic thrown objects, using anything not bolted down as a lethal weapon. He particularly had a tendency for lightsaber throws in order to dispatch formations. Furthermore, Anakin largely favored Force grip as a means to throttle targets or to crush their rib cages. He mainly has used Force grip against enemy combatants, though he has occasionally used it on allies and subordinates as a form of intimidation. As a whole, when Anakin kept a cool head, his application of the Force was very similar to Obi-Wan Kenobi's within producing efficient results. However, while Kenobi favored taking the path of least resistance and using subtle applications for devastating results, Anakin more often than not favored the direct approach of fully leveraging his power, opting to bash aside and tear through targets by channeling his rage. While Anakin's use of Force powers was rather simplistic, that did not mean he wasn't capable of using it with great ingenuity, such as when he threw a cluster of explosives from the wall to the bounty hunter Dirge. However, Anakin would most consistently only resort to the Force when provoked into doing so, and it was not a first instinct. Instead, he would be reactive with it, and would often spam certain powers when caught within his rage. This isn't to say that Anakin wasn't willing to use the Force, but he typically favored simply pounding his targets into submission through lightsaber combat. Overall, Anakin was a Force juggernaut power met with an adequate level of development and ingenuity. However, his applications were not settled or crafty, and instead opted to take overwhelming power when provoked into using his abilities. In conclusion, Anakin's application of the Force was a contradiction. On one hand, he was the most naturally gifted Force wielder of all time, considered at least the second most powerful Jedi of his era, and possessed magnitude with his ability that would be seen as a tactical nuke. But he never sought to develop his abilities beyond basic combative powers, which resulted in him having a very uneven skill set. Instead of truly gaining intimate understanding, he banked on his raw talent. What Anakin represented was the same as what so many Jedi in the Order were falling into during his era, their journey into the Force being distorted and corrupted by the violence of war. As Count Dooku once highlighted, Anakin was already half Sith and didn't even know it. After his injuries sustained following his duel on Mustafar, Darth Vader's potential became capped as a result of losing too much living tissue, which had depleted his total midichlorian count. As such, Vader no longer possessed the ability to become more powerful than his master Darth Sidious. To add on to this, Vader's sensitive cybernetic implants blocked his access from certain powers. However, in spite of these new limitations, Vader adapted quickly, and like his lightsaber technique, had to retool the way he made use of his powers. In terms of physical augmentation, Vader mainly maintained a focus on augmenting his strength, stamina, and endurance, allowing his already tanky build to be further enhanced. However, in terms of speed and agility, Vader could no longer achieve the same gymnastics he formerly could, and as such, his augmentation instead had aided Vader to achieve Force speed and acrobatics in short, calculated bursts. Vader could also use his Dark Rage to temporarily heal his lungs in the event of the respirator being disabled. However, he could not make these effects permanent, as the joy of being able to freely breathe compromised his focus to the dark side that enabled the healing process in the first place. Unfortunately for the Dark Lord, the delicate electronics of his life support system, combined with the lack of living tissue within his hands, left Vader incapable of using Force lightning, and any attempt to do so would only backfire on him. While Darth Vader could deflect blaster fire with the use of Tuta Menace, he was incapable of properly deflecting Force lightning with the ability. However, given Darth Vader's career as a Jedi hunter and military enforcer, it was rare for anyone to exploit these weaknesses during his life, though these limitations did somewhat put Vader's viability against other Darksiders into question. Like many other Sith, Vader was trained within the use of Doom Monk, which was a psychological warfare technique that was used to manipulate the opponent with verbal taunts and goading, in order to get the opponent to doubt their own abilities and succumb to fear. Darth Vader's main displays of Doom Monk were presented in both his telepathic skills as well as his conduct with telekinesis. In terms of telepathy, Darth Vader was able to mentally contact and probe the minds of opposing Force wielders, using the extracted information as ammunition for manipulating and goading opponents within fights, dominating their spirits before crushing their lives. To complement this, Vader's use of telekinesis was extremely impressive, with his lifting strength being able to levitate and propel the likes of massive boulders, large trees, starships, and Kaminoan platforms with only minor levels of difficulty. His kinetic output enabled him to explosively shatter stone, and he could reliably penetrate the telekinetic barrier of other adepts, with only Council Master Force wielders being able to reliably defend against his onslaught. In terms of variety of abilities under the Sith Lord's exposure, Darth Vader was most common in employing devastating force waves capable of fatally dispatching large groups, direct telekinetic assaults such as Force Strangulation and Force Crush, consistent hurling of thrown objects, precise lightsaber throws,
and force shield defenses. Within conduct, he primarily used his telekinesis to bring about environmental influence, whether through creating distractions to throw the opponent off their game, endanger them with environmental hazards to throw them off balance, or cause the opponent to lose their composure through projections of raw force power and grind them down. Darth Vader in many ways followed the tactical doctrine that Obi-Wan Kenobi used and applied it in a Sith mindset. A fight is not a goal in and of itself. Sometimes it is just a distraction to the true goal and best countered with a larger distraction. However, in spite of Darth Vader's raw power and discipline as a Darksider, he was never able to completely extinguish the light within him. As a result, Vader was prone to insecurity when his commitment as a Darksider was being challenged, and left him vulnerable to psychological manipulation. The Darth Maul doppelganger leveraged this weakness by questioning Vader's worthiness as a Sith Lord, causing Darth Vader to give in to his rage and admit to Maul that the hatred driving his connection to the dark side was for himself. Later on, Luke Skywalker would also question Vader's commitment to the dark side, but instead did so through appealing to Vader's compassion, which undermined his resolve and eventually caused the light side in Anakin Skywalker to return shortly before his self-sacrifice. Overall, Darth Vader's capabilities as a Force wielder was built as a polar opposite of his younger self, Anakin Skywalker. Because of Vader's very ability to use the Force being crippled, he was forced to effectively rebuild himself from the ground up, and instead of being capable of leaning on natural talent like he could as a Jedi, he instead had to work hard through intense discipline, training, and practice to truly capitalize on the power he had left. However, this caused him to become a greater Force wielder than he ever was before. While Darth Vader would never wield the power he could have previously unlocked, he knows how to make what he does have count. Much like their skills with a lightsaber, both Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader were rooted in consistent similarities but also drastic differences. Anakin Skywalker was, without question, the most naturally gifted Force wielder of all time, growing to become at least the second most powerful Jedi by his confrontation with Dooku on the Invisible Hand. He was neither lacking in range nor magnitude. However, while Anakin was powerful, he was also limited by his own lack of reverence. While he was good at using the Force as a blunt instrument, he never bothered to develop his skills beyond that within single combat. Meanwhile, Darth Vader, while lacking the potential of who he could have become before, and generally not having the same raw power as Anakin, did achieve a similar raw power level to him, and compensated with superior range of application, general skill and development, as well as output. As telekinetics both shared similar magnitudes, but Vader employs his powers more actively and creatively, weaponizing the environment to gain tactical advantage and undermine his opponent's resolve through major projections of power. Because of their comparable level, direct telekinetic assaults and strangulations will not be applicable against each other unless caught off guard. Vader's vulnerability to Force lightning also stands as a non-factor, given that Anakin has not had any display of energy-based attacks. As telepaths, Vader has a clear advantage as he commonly probed the mind of his opponent to gain knowledge and use the information as fuel for psychological warfare tactics. Meanwhile, while Anakin's own skill with telepathy are not by any means lacking, he has never displayed weaponizing it in single combat. What this comes down to is that while Anakin can cancel out many of Vader's advantages, there is nothing he is doing that would put Vader at a disadvantage, and Vader still has greater control, variety, and activeness with his powers. Darth Vader gains the edge as a Force wielder. During the Clone Wars, Anakin Skywalker would wear typical battle armor contemporary within Jedi at the time. However, by the later stages of the war, he would revert to typical Jedi robes like his contemporaries. Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber was a simple and standard model, but elegantly designed. It contained a throttle-style activator, a bridged hand grip, and a curved emitter shroud. It was fitted with a blue Ilum crystal as the focusing lens, which granted the blade respectable cutting power with excellent maneuverability and handling. When encased within the cybernetic suit, Darth Vader's helmet was enhanced with Sith alchemy, which enabled the helmet to have a moderate resistance to lightsaber hits. To add on to this, Vader's pauldrons were also lightsaber resistant. In terms of mechanical enhancements to his Force abilities, Darth Vader's right gauntlet was equipped with one of the amulets of Lord Khan. While the exact properties of the amulet is unknown, I agree with Gensarai 1 that the best educated guess that can be reached is that it enhances telepathic abilities. In regard to Darth Vader's most significant weapon, his lightsaber was a power tool. Built with a design typical of Form 5 specialists, his weapon was built upon a throttle-style activator, a bridged hand grip, and a heavy emitter shroud. It also utilizes a diadium power cell. For most of Darth Vader's career, his lightsaber contained one single red synthetic crystal as the focusing lens. However, he would later trade it in for a red Adegan crystal, trading the superior cutting power for the reliability and maneuverability of the natural gem. Darth Vader's lightsaber was also equipped with a dual phase function, which enabled him to enlarge the blade by half a meter above its size, utilized to probe particularly dangerous targets. This conclusion is obvious. While Anakin has an excellently designed weapon, it does not provide him any mechanical advantages outside of familiarity. Meanwhile, Vader's lightsaber benefits from the dual phase function, providing him more options in combat. On top of this, Darth Vader's lightsaber-resistant helmet and pauldrons provide him a marginal room for error that Anakin simply does not have. Cap it off with an amulet that further enhances his powers, and the results become clear. Darth Vader gets the edge in armaments. And now, the verdict. Both Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader stand as two sides of the same man's life. The gifted prodigy versus the broken cripple. While their physical advantages, combat forms, and magnitude of power were similar, where they varied most was the method such attributes were utilized. Anakin Skywalker took his natural gifts and used them to allow him to effectively punch up anyone he went up against through sheer force of will. In essence, an athlete with a lightsaber. Meanwhile, Darth Vader, beginning with his body being crippled and his mind being torn, had to force himself to essentially rebuild his power base from scratch, reconfiguring his technique to suit his new handicaps and explore the full range of his power that he had left. What this meant was that while Vader could never reach the same highs Anakin could, he did excel to overall be greater than he was before. While Anakin was limited, Vader was broad. While Anakin seeked to dig deep and power through, Vader seeked to undermine and unbalance. While Anakin fought harder, Vader fought smarter. What it comes down to is this: Anakin Skywalker is not throwing anything to the table that Darth Vader would not be able to prepare himself against. Anakin may be the most skillful Form 5 duelist of his era, but his technique still leaves massive openings and he has very few fallback options. Anakin may be one of the most powerful Force wielders in the history of the Jedi Order, but he never bothered to gain any reverence for the power he wielded, and instead used it in the most simplistic way imaginable. While Darth Vader is by no means a Sith academic, he took time and learned through trial and error how to perfect his form and capitalize on the full range of his power. And Anakin's physical advantage, notable it may be, is not significant enough to turn the contest into his favor. Make no mistake, Anakin Skywalker does possess the skill and experience necessary to defeat Vader. and there is a possibility that Anakin could overwhelm Vader in a similar fashion to Luke, but I don't see that as the most likely outcome. What is more likely is that the fight would quickly devolve into a slugging match and war of attrition, a marathon of wit and will, and if that occurs, Vader holds every combat advantage. The way I see this fight playing out would be a combination of the Mustafar duel and Luke Skywalker's second fight with Vader on Bespin. The early engagement would open with fast bursts of lightsaber clashes. Anakin would no doubt be the aggressor, attempting to overcome Vader outright, while Vader would get a feel for his younger self, letting himself remember the skills, techniques, and tactics he once used. This is where Anakin has the largest window to win, as if his physical output could catch Vader off guard, he may overwhelm him quickly in a similar manner that he did to Count Dooku, especially if Vader began the fight arrogantly. However, I do not find this result likely, as it is more probable that Vader would assume an active defensive posture until he recognized Anakin's patterns. The mid-fight is where Vader would begin responding with his own line of attacks, working to bind Anakin's blade and subvert him with telekinesis. He would also begin using psychological warfare tactics on Anakin, likely telling him of his future failures and how it was his destiny to become Vader. This would likely undermine Anakin's resolve before he doubles down and unleashes everything he has. However, Vader would expect this and would keep his guard up against any lightsaber strikes, use telekinesis to cancel the momentum of any thrown objects, and his TK barrier is strong enough to endure any direct assaults. By the late fight, both would be going all out. However, while Anakin would be ramping up his output, Vader would be biding his time, waiting for an opening. Eventually, Anakin would provide one, and in a similar manner to Obi-Wan Kenobi, Vader would dispatch the Chosen One limb for limb. Darth Vader would proceed to leave, allowing Anakin to live so he can eventually become his future self. I declare Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, the victor.